Hello, this is Professor DePaulo welcoming you back to Psych 265 fully online. And today we're going to be studying ethics and making ethical decisions in research. Your research study can yield interesting and useful findings, or at least the one that you're proposing, but sometimes you have to ask yourself, is it worth it? Is the study worth carrying out? Are the risks too high? Is there going to be a long-term problem with the study? And there's been many great or famous studies in psychology that I would say are unethical. And we're going to be talking about the Milgram study and, of course, the Stanford prison experiment, where there were quite impactful results, but, you know, was it okay to carry out this research? And could we carry out this research in modern day psychology? So what are ethics? Well, let's introduce this with an ethical dilemma that you have to make a decision on. Prior to your midterm in your Introduction to Psychology course, the professor informs the class that a copy of the exam has mysteriously disappeared from her office. She says that if the guilty party does not come forward, all 100 students in the class will receive a 0. Due to your university's strict honor code, the dean will certainly expel the person who stole the exam. You know who it was, and it was your best friend who took it. So what do? Do you decide to turn in your best friend, or do you decide to take a 0 along with everybody else? And this is a tricky decision, and we may disagree on what the appropriate course of action is in this scenario. So what could you do? Well, easily you can report it. That will save the innocent people that are in the class, or maybe not so innocent, depending on, what role they played in sort of helping the student facilitate this theft of the exam. But let's say they are innocent. They shouldn't receive a 0. They have done nothing wrong. However, if your best friend gets expelled, or for stealing the exam, is that worth losing a friendship over? Probably you lose that friendship forever. So, if you only care about your own selfish interests, then you maintain the friend. But if you care about other people and you care about what's right, maybe you turn your friend in and that person gets expelled. And different people will give different answers to the situation. And I wouldn't say there's one correct answer. There's a variety of ways you can go with this, and you can justify it to yourself and justify it to others. So let's introduce some ethical perspectives in terms of decision making. The first one is the utilitarian perspective. And this means that your decision should go on to do the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So in this case, from a utilitarian perspective, obviously turning your best friend in would be the solution. You turn your best friend in, 99 other people are no longer punished from your best friend's action of stealing the exam. So it's basically 99 people are, their lives are improved versus one person's life is, kind of tarnished in this way, probably forever. So it becomes 99 to 1. So you would side then with the class and you would turn your best friend in if you're going by strict utilitarian theory. The altruistic perspective says that helping others without personal benefit is the goal. And the best action is the most selfless action, although you may have to decide whether it's more selfless to take a 0 on the midterm or to sacrifice a friendship for the good of the class. So this has nothing to do with you. This has to do with everybody else, right? So forget about your friendship. That's not important. What about these other 99 people in the class or 100 people in the class? You're going to basically tarnish them. You're going to hurt them. So from an altruistic perspective, you're going to turn your friend in because, helping others is what you should be doing. And your personal friendship should play no role in the decision that you make. So both the utilitarian perspective and the altruistic perspective say, turn your friend in for stealing the exam. You also have egoism, which states that the individual should act in accordance with their own self-interest. From the egoistic perspective, screw these 100 people that are your classmates. Who cares about them? Save your best friend. Say nothing. Why turn your best friend in if that's going to hurt you? It's going to hurt you. You're going to lose a friend. This is your best friend. You might lose them forever. And your life is going to take a downturn from it. It's going to be more miserable because your best friend will not want to talk to you anymore. So who cares about these people? They have no relationship to you. You owe nothing to them. So do what's best for you, which means don't turn your best friend in, let them get away with it, and just ignore what happens to the other people in the class. Let me walk you through another ethical dilemma. In this situation, Sam feels pressure to keep her grades up because she has her sights set on attending a prestigious medical school. However, this semester has been tough because all of her classes will base her final grade on a curve. Knowing she needs to study more but feeling unable to keep up, Sam decides to take Adderall. Though the powerful drug may help her stay awake and focus, it also leads to general nervousness, sleep problems, heart problems, shortness of breath, and stomach problems. So in this situation, what should you do? Should Sam take drugs to allow her to study more? Well, obviously Adderall is given to people with ADHD, and it has a paradoxical effect. It's a potent stimulant. It's basically speed, and it basically slows down people that have ADHD. So people with ADHD are kind of sped up. They can't focus. Adderall, for some reason, has this paradoxical effect on them and slows down their thought process and their decision making. And now they can focus. However, if used recreationally, like in this particular situation with Sam, it's going to act as a stimulant in someone without ADHD. And it's going to keep Sam awake, and it's going to give Sam the advantage. Well, possibly give Sam the advantage because she's going to be able to stay up late and study really, really hard, to study long, and it's going to help her get into a prestigious medical school. On the other hand, it could have a myriad of side effects. It could lead to nervousness, sleep problems. Those are the very mild side effects. More importantly, heart problems. High blood pressure, hypertensive crisis in some cases, where someone's blood pressure skyrockets to the point where they could stroke out, basically have a stroke and die, or have some other serious problems like organ damage due to extreme elevated blood pressure. Or it could lead to tachycardia, a fast heart rate that can get extreme and lead to arrhythmia. So there's a lot of dangers here of taking the drug, and is it worth taking the drug, to get a better grade, or is it too risky to take the drug because it can lead to these physical problems? It also could lead to psychological dependency also. If you take the drug and you like that feeling, then you take it more and more and more, and it becomes a habit. You don't want to give it up. So this is a tricky situation because this is done all the time in the college age population, whether it's with Adderall, whether it's with excessive amounts of not cocaine. let's hope it's not excessive amounts of cocaine, excessive amounts of caffeine. All right, I don't recommend excessive amounts of cocaine to keep you up and study and focus. This is not a good idea. Excessive amounts of caffeine, usually like through, over-the-counter products that, no dose. These have no dose pills, keep you awake. Caffeine pills, the 5-hour energy, all that stuff. Herbal products like ephedra, things that are used for weight loss as well. Those are very potent stimulants. There's a lot of problems with going this route just to try to keep yourself awake. So what are the risks? What are the rewards? And are the risks higher than the rewards? In my analysis, they are. But everybody makes a different decision. Are you willing to bet on yourself? Are you willing to risk your health and your well-being because you want to achieve something? And in this case, Sam might want to do that. So, how do you make this kind of decision in this very, very murky situation? So let's go back and revisit the Milgram study, which I'm sure you are familiar with at this point in your studies. And Stanley Milgram wanted to empirically investigate the impact of situational factors on people's willingness to obey an authority figure. So basically in this study, to summarize, he had participants come in and they were told they were playing a memory game where they would read off a list of words, and the person behind the glass, or in the other room, I should say, they couldn't see the person, uh, was a Confederate. That means he was someone that was working for the experimenter, for Milgram, right? And he had to be shocked every time he gave the wrong answer. So you were the participant, and you were shocking this Confederate, this guy that worked for the experimenter. He was in on it. He was an actor. Basically, the shocks weren't real, but he acted as if the shocks were real. And every time every time he got a wrong answer on purpose, you would have to shock him as the participant. And that gradually built up to the point where he was getting higher and higher amounts of shock. And then he complained of a heart problem, and you still had to shock him. And then when he stopped responding, the participant, which is you, would still have to shock him. So, is this ethical? I mean, it was looking at willingness to obey an authority figure. And most people did carry out to the full extent, which was 450 volts of electricity. They thought they were giving this poor guy. So basically, 2/3 of all participants thought that they were shocking this guy at 450 volts, which would be enough to kill him. And the fact that he didn't respond made many participants believe that they were actually killing him. And in my opinion, this is a famous study, but it's one of the most unethical studies within psychology. It's a horrible study, honestly. I think this study was, it was impactful. People cite it all the time. It's a very important study because it gave us some information about the willingness of human beings to follow a charismatic leader or charismatic authority figure. But the amount of stress that the participants got by thinking they shocked this poor guy and they shocked him to death, I mean, that amount of stress, imagine you were shocking someone, you thought you killed the guy. And after the study, the participants were just extremely agitated, nervous, unsettled. Some were smoking, a lot in excess after the study. And then they were finally told that, oh, by the way, it was just, it's fake. We used deception. Basically, we lied to you about the study because we wanted you to believe that you were testing memory. In fact, we were testing your willingness to follow a charismatic authority figure. Well, at that point, the damage is done. I mean, you thought you possibly killed this guy. The amount of, grief and stress and trauma on the body is long lasting. And there was really no way to reverse this. So although this is an impactful study, it was extremely problematic, in my opinion. Now, by the late 70s, the Belmont Report was released. And the Belmont Report basically stated that, yes, a lot of the previous research done in this country, in the United States, was problematic. And we need to change how we conduct studies and how we approve studies in this country. So before the Belmont Report, there really was no IRB, the Institutional Review Board. There was no control over what kind of studies that you were running. Obviously, the Stanford prison experiment, the Milgram Study, and I'll talk a little bit about the Willowbrook hepatitis project and the Tuskegee syphilis project. These are horrible, horrible research studies done in this country. This is not done in Nazi Germany. This is done in the United States. And so we have a not so proud past to look back upon. And as researchers today, we have to realize that these kind of unethical studies are not to be tolerated, not to be approved, and these types of studies could never be run again in this country. And the Belmont Report basically said that. It was written in around 1978, and it said you need to take into consideration a couple of factors. And the first principle was beneficence and now maleficence, which basically means you want to make sure there's a cost-benefit analysis. The benefits should outweigh the costs or negative experiences or risk to participants. You want to keep your study low risk. And if you have risk, you want to minimize that risk. You want to act with the purpose of benefiting others. That's beneficence. And obviously now maleficence is do no harm. And that's probably the most important factor here is do no harm. No matter what kind of study you want to run, you don't want to hurt anybody, physically or psychologically. So one way of doing no harm is protecting the participants' responses from becoming publicly known. And if you're using a confidential study, most of the time you're coding their responses. So basically, instead of using their name or social security number, you're using some random number or some random alphanumeric code to then link up their results, their responses. So no one will know who they are because they'll have just an alphanumeric code assigned to them. And basically the sheet that links up their alphanumeric code to their real name will be only obtained by the experimenter. No one else will have access to this. Or you can run it as completely anonymous, which means they don't provide anything. So participants are not, their names are not anything, no identifiable information is available to the researcher. Now, if you're doing like a before and after study, which is called a repeated measure design, or you're doing some kind of longitudinal study, you're probably going to have to use confidentiality instead of anonymity, because confidentiality means you can link up the responses from various time periods. Anonymity means that you can't link up anything because there's no identifiable information anywhere. So if you're running a long-term study, confidentiality is good. If you're running a one-time deal, a one-shot study, then if you can, use anonymity. Don't put their names or anything else on the study. Types of harm that can be done, well, there's plenty, right? I mean, not only could their responses become available in public, but they could be harmed in a variety of other ways, like through the experiment can harm them. Maybe there's a stressor that's so toxic to them that makes them break down, either physically or psychologically. So their body can be distressed by research. So there are some studies that are more physical in nature. There's one study that looks at stress where they have to put their entire arm in a bucket of ice water. That's extremely cold, and they're using that as a measure of stress. Well, if they leave their arm in the bucket of ice water too long, they may end up with frostbite, and that could be problematic. So you don't want to do any physical harm to people running a study. You could also do psychological harm where you cause emotional stress. And you see that in the Milgram study. Participants were severely emotionally distressed because they thought they basically killed the guy. And so you have to minimize these two, both minimize physical and psychological harm to the participant. But you also have to consider the cost of not doing the research. So you may think the research has some risks, but is there a cost to not carrying it out and not learning about the human condition? And so you have to weigh that. What are the risks and what are the benefits of the study? And if the benefits are much greater than the risk, then you would want to carry out the study. If the risks are too high compared to the benefits, then it's not worth it. Try to design a study in a different way to alleviate this concern. The second principle of the Belmont Report is justice, which is fairness in deciding who to use as participants. So you don't want to just use one particular group of people because they're convenient. That's not fair. For example, in the Tuskegee syphilis study, which is an abomination, to be honest, it's almost mind-boggling, like something like this could happen in this country. So in the study, which I described shortly, predominantly African American, poor African Americans in the 1930s through the 1970s, who were infected by syphilis, they were not treated. So basically, they had gone to a medical center in Alabama, and basically they were not treated. They were ignored. They were told there's no treatment for syphilis, even though syphilis could be toxic to the nervous system and dangerous and actually deadly in some cases. And people had died in the Tuskegee syphilis study. It lasted for like 40 years. So imagine having a disease that is very easily cured with antibiotics. So when penicillin was discovered about 15 or 16 years after the study was started, they could have offered penicillin to the participants and their syphilis would have been cleared up. But instead, the researchers decided to not offer penicillin to any participants and to let them suffer because they wanted to see what is the long-term outcome of having syphilis? What will it do to the body? And so they selected poor black participants, poor black men, because they said, well, people don't value poor black men. There's not going to be outrage in the community if we use poor black men. We don't want to use rich white men. That would be horrible, right? I mean, rich white men in our study and, having them suffer. No one cares about poor black men. And back in the 1930s, that sentiment was basically true. That the general public didn't know about the study per se at the time, but the government was making decisions on running the study, said, we'll use poor black men because they're easily disposable and no one will care about them getting sick or them suffering. And that is an absolute disgrace and shameful and almost hard to believe that something like that would happen in this country. There was also a study that I'll describe shortly on stuttering, and what the researchers did was they tried to induce stuttering behavior. They tried to show that stuttering was a learned behavior in children, and they took orphans. So they took children out of an orphanage, predominantly because since they're orphans, no one will care what happens to them. And if we induce stuttering in orphans, it's going to be far less problematic than inducing stuttering in children with families, because now the families will come after us. There'll be a public, outrage over it. But if we use orphans, no one will care. So the principle of justice is saying, we have to make fair decisions about who to use as participants. Don't just use populations of people that you think no one will care about. This is not fair. Why should you use all poor black men on a study? Use rich white men too. Just don't limit it to one section of the population that you feel is you can ignore them. And that was done many, many times, especially in the early part of the 20th century. Belmont principle number 3 is respect for persons. So autonomy is the idea that people are able to make their own decisions, they're given informed consent, and they can choose to either participate in the study or to walk away and not participate. So you should always give people a choice. No one should be forced into doing anything. They should be given enough information to make an informed decision. And part of this informed decision comes with the informed consent form, which is basically a form detailing the sort of what's going to happen during the study on an 8th grade writing level so that everyone can understand, so free of jargon. So this is what's going to happen. This is what the study is about. This is how long it's going to take. These are the possible benefits and the risks. And this is how much we're going to pay you or compensate you if we decide to do that. And that's all laid out in this informed consent form. And that has to be approved by the place you're doing research at. So when I do my research at BMCC, that has to be approved by CUNY. So I have an informed consent form that is given to the participants. They have to read it, sign off on it, that they agree to participate, and they have to be made aware of what the study's about. Now, there are some cases where you need to use deception, just like in the Milgram study, where you have to tweak it a little bit. I'm not going to say outright lie, but tell them not completely what the study's about. Tell them partially what the study's about, because if you tell them the full truth, it may affect their responses. So Milgram used deception, and he told participants that he was conducting a memory study, when in fact he was conducting a study about authority. But if he told people, hey, we're doing a study on authority, that may influence their decisions, that may influence how well they go along with the researcher. So he had to kind of use deception at the beginning. Well, not kind of, he used blatant deception at the beginning. And at the end of the study, he had to use what's called debriefing. And debriefing is you basically tell the participant what the study was about and why we needed to deceive you at the beginning. And you make sure they understand why deception is necessary. So if you're going to use deception in the informed consent in the study, you need to follow it up with debriefing at the end of the study to clarify what the study is about and why we need to deceive at the start. Informed consent, as I mentioned, talks about general purpose. It's voluntary participation. That means you could leave at any time. You don't have to complete the study. And obviously risks. You need to specify some of the risks so they can make an informed decision. And with risk benefits. And so you're doing that cost-benefit analysis and obviously freedom to withdraw at any time. Now, in minors under the age of 18 cannot give consent, cannot give informed consent, but they can give assent. Assent is an agreement to participate in a minor. Now, this is generally given in minors. It can be given in people that have intellectual disability or cannot make decisions on their own, but it's usually given by minors. So the minor gives assent, the minor agrees to it, but then the parent must give the informed consent as the guardian of the minor. So until the age of 18. Once the child turns 18, they can now consent on their own. Here's what the informed consent form looks like. So you basically introduce the study, what's going to happen. You give the participant the ability to contact either the researcher or the institutional review board if there's any questions or problems. And then you basically have them sign. So the participant has to sign and the researcher has to sign as well. And this is basically an agreement saying, I explained the study to you and you've agreed to participate, and this form laid it all out to you. A lot of this is a legal kind of necessity that basically the participant doesn't sue the researcher or the college or the university if there's a problem. So the informed consent is the only way to go. You cannot do research without an informed consent form. So let me run through some of the more famous studies that were unethical going back, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 years ago in this country. As I mentioned before, the Tuskegee syphilis study was 4 decades, from 1932 to 1972, where the U.S. Public Health Service looked at syphilis on 400 low-income African-American men from rural parts of Tuskegee, Alabama. Most of them were illiterate sharecroppers, so they couldn't even read a consent form, but they were not given a consent form because this is 1932. There was no need for this. They were just basically put in the study against their will. So the U.S. Health Service wanted to study the natural progression of untreated syphilis, and they told the participants they were being treated for bad blood. And they would include free health care and burial insurance, something that they didn't have. So the fact that they were told there's something wrong with you, but we're going to take care of it for free. And on top of that, if things went really bad and you somehow died, we'll provide your family burial insurance so they won't have to pay for it. So you see they're put at a big disadvantage because they're poor. They have no money for any of the stuff. They don't have health care. And they don't have burial insurance, and they're told that they have something medically wrong with them. And they're also told that they'll treat it for free. So how do you think a poor black man in 1932 would feel about participation? They would say, "Wow, this is great. You're going to treat me for free. You're going to give me burial insurance in case something bad happens to me. My family's not burdened with this." This sounds like a great opportunity, but Little did they know that they would be tortured throughout the entire duration of the study. Not physically tortured, but tortured by having untreated syphilis, which causes neurological deficit, can cause blindness, and can lead to death in some cases. Participants also received warnings about dismissal from the study for seeking outside medical treatment. So basically, they were discouraged from getting a second opinion, discouraged from going somewhere else, because they would lose the funding for the study. And in reality, these researchers had no interest in curing syphilis because they wanted to look at what would happen, and they collected their data through autopsies. When penicillin became available in 1947, they lied to these people. They said there's no effective treatment, and they were not given effective treatment, so they were not given access to penicillin. This is extremely unethical. Basically, torturing these poor men who were severely, disadvantaged economically and kind of pressured into the study. It's just a travesty. It's an absolute disgrace that something like this happened in this country. I know it was 1932, and almost 100 years since then. But something like this should never be allowed to happen under any circumstance. And thankfully today in modern research, you will never see something like this happen again. Now, can the government, U.S. government, conduct their own studies? Who knows? I'm not going to get into conspiracy theories. They're all over the place. I don't know what's right, what's wrong. I don't work for the government. Who knows what's going on? But something like this, I would hope, would never happen again in this country. So let's say that you were a therapist and you have your own ethical dilemma because you developed a treatment for depression and suicidal ideation. To test this treatment, you randomly assign patients to either the treatment group or to the control group, and you found that your treatment works very well. And this is what's happening with a lot of drug trials, cancer trials. Do you let participants commit suicide by not treating them? Let's say they're in the control condition. They're getting no treatment in your study. And now some of them want to commit suicide. Do you let them commit suicide? Or do you say, hey, wait a minute, we have an effective treatment. I'm going to get you out of the control condition and put you in the treatment condition. This is debatable. There's no one right answer. From a scientific perspective, you can't do that. But from a humanitarian perspective, you can't just let people die because they're in the control condition. And the same thing happens with cancer research. I mean, cancer research is, unfortunately, I've had some personal experience dealing with trying to get people into experimental cancer trials, where, to qualify for the study is very difficult to begin with. And then once you qualify for the study, for the experimental treatment, you may get the control condition where they're not treating you, or they're giving you the standard treatment. They're not even giving you the experimental treatment that might save your life. And if you're in the control condition, you might die. But according to the cancer researchers, we need the control condition because we have to see if our treatment works. We can't just give everybody the experimental treatment. But from a patient perspective or from a family perspective, if your family member is very, very sick with advanced cancer or some severe illness, and the conventional treatments are not going to work for them, and it's between, do I want to get them into an experimental trial, or do I want them to just go with the standard treatment and cross my fingers, but they're probably going to die? Well, I know how I feel. I call up Sloan Kettering and I tell them, I want to get my family member into an experimental treatment. You've got all these different treatments you're bragging about. Get this person into the treatment. And you know what they say to me? This person does not qualify for the experimental treatment. So, right there, why have experimental treatments if people can't receive them? Well, they can, but they only select the people they want in the experimental treatments. If these people are not prime candidates to them, they will not select them. And if these people are not prime candidates to them, they will not They're not going to select them because it's their data. They don't want bad data. They want the best data to show that their treatment works because it's a big money maker. It's a huge financial boost if an experimental cancer treatment works. So there's a lot of unethical things happening. I don't think it's ethical to let people die, but the people at Sloan Kettering say, it's our research. We need a control condition, and we only want you if you meet X, Y, and Z criteria. Otherwise, we're not going to even give you a chance. We're just going to stand here and watch you die. And that's what they do. Every day they do this. And it's nothing against Sloan Kettering because it's done everywhere. It's done at Hopkins. It's done at all the major cancer centers throughout the world, right? There has to be a control condition and there has to be entry criteria. But from a patient perspective or from a family perspective, if you have a loved one that's going to die and they need the treatment, to you, that doesn't sound too ethical when you're denied this. Or, you're put in a control condition. What good is that? Well, to solidify your study, my father, mother, grandfather, grandmother, aunt, uncle, brother, sister must die because they're in the control condition, or they're denied into the experiment altogether. It's a very difficult situation, especially when it comes to life and death experimentation or new drugs that can save a loved one. You don't want to be in the control condition, and you don't want to be left out of the study. Here's the other case that I was talking about, the monster study, where a speech expert and psychologist was trying to see if he could teach, basically, if he can have these children learn to stutter, because he believed that stuttering was brought about through reinforcement. This is a very popular time for behaviorism, 1939. So obviously, if I could show that stuttering is all due to behaviorism, that was the popular movement. And that would fit in with, Watson and Skinner's beliefs. So he took children from a local orphanage and he tried to turn them into stutterers. That's just horribly unethical. Why would you first off, you're taking orphans who are disadvantaged to begin with, right? This is, something you wouldn't want to do. Why not take, children with families? Why just take orphans? Because no one's going to make a big fuss if something happens to orphans because they have no families, right? It's a big problem in thinking that way. And then you're trying to turn these children into stutterers. Terrible. Terrible idea, with no idea how to reverse it, by the way. So what he found was they didn't become stutterers, although if he badgered them and pestered them, they developed very low self-esteem. And when they got older, they continued to believe that they had real speech problems after the study ended. So here the costs way, way more than the benefits. Just not worth it. Terrible study. 1939. Then in the 1940s, there was a bunch of case studies focusing on the US government once again, looking at the impact of venereal diseases on the military. And so what they did was they tried to purposefully infect participants with STDs. How wonderful. We're worried about our military getting STDs, so what we're going to do is we're going to study transmission of STDs and the effects of STDs, and we're going to use participants who don't want to be involved in the study. So they were looking at gonorrhea and syphilis, and so what they did was they took inmates. What a disaster. So they're trying to expose prisoners to bacteria collected from local prostitutes. So prisoners are disadvantaged. They're in jail. They don't have rights to walk away. They kind of feel forced to be in the study. Okay, and you're torturing them by trying to purposely infect them with STDs from prostitutes. Yeah, just shameful. And then based on these studies, they carried out more studies in Guatemala where they took 5,000 orphans, prostitutes, soldiers, and individuals with psychiatric disorders, and they exposed 1,300 of those people to venereal diseases. Once again, they didn't ask the participants if they wanted to be involved in the study, because who wants to be involved in a study where you're going to be exposed to venereal diseases? They even, in some cases, the researchers placed gonorrhea pus into a participant's eyes to purposely infect them. And then they withheld treatment for months, even though people were suffering from the effects of these STDs. And many of these individuals suffered for years, if not their entire lives, because they didn't have money to pay for treatment. So you're doing research on prisoners, you're doing research on poor people, and you're not telling them anything about it, and you're making them suffer for no reason other than we want to see what's going to happen. We just want to have information on the diseases. And we're the U.S. government, and we don't care about anybody else. If we want to do this, we're going to do this. And that's what they did. Once again, horribly, horribly unethical. And of course, one of my least favorite studies of all time, the Stanford prison experiment, where Philip Zimbardo wanted to see if being in prison were the result of situational pressures or personality traits. So basically what he did here is he wanted to see how people reacted to being prisoners and people reacted to being guards. So he assigned half undergraduate students at Stanford that were in the study. Half of them were assigned to be prisoners, and the other half were assigned to be guards. And what he found out is over a period of a couple of days, the guards became physically and verbally abusive towards the prisoners, and the prisoners were breaking down physically and psychologically, staging hunger strikes, and just having an emotional breakdown, crying, trying to get out of there, wanting to get out of there, feeling trapped. And Philip Zimbardo basically sat there, and he was the warden of the prison, so-called prison, which was done in the basement of Stanford University at the time. And he kind of sat there and said, "This is great. You know, I'm learning a lot. This is going to be a great paper I can write up. I'm going to become very famous." And that's what happened. He became very famous. He's extremely famous now. Everyone knows who Philip Zimbardo is. And he didn't want to stop the study. He stopped the study because his girlfriend basically forced him to stop the study after just 6 days. He was comfortable running the whole 2 weeks of the study, even though the prisoners were having nervous breakdowns and they were severely traumatized. So what did he show? He showed that if the guards wear shades and they wear uniforms, they basically feel like they can do whatever they want to the prisoners. This is the process known as de-individuation, that their individual identities become masked because they're part of this collective unit. And when their identities become masked in this way, they can act on these primal impulses to beat and torture these prisoners. So they kind of lost themselves in their roles. Why Zimbardo wanted to keep watching this for 2 weeks, I have no idea. But it was horribly unethical, and even though it's lauded in many psychology courses, I absolutely despise this experiment, and I absolutely despise what Zimbardo did, and the fact that he was okay continuing the experiment for, had to be stopped basically by his girlfriend. You also probably are familiar with the case of little Albert, where little Albert was classically conditioned to fear white rats and other soft white things eventually. Where every time little Albert was playing with the white rat, he heard a loud banging sound, and eventually just the mere presence of the white rat became terrifying to little Albert. So imagine you're doing a study where you're basically creating a phobia in a small child. I mean, I can't imagine this. This is horribly unethical. We're trying to eliminate phobias, not create them. But that's what was done at this point by Watson and his colleagues. Obviously, this is beginning a part of the 20th century, so it was a long time ago, almost 100 years ago. And he showed that you could classically condition a phobia. That's readily known today, right? That's why this research was important. But the fact that this baby was suffering, this young child had to suffer to the benefit of Watson's research, it's not ethical. Something like this should not be done today, and it's just horrible to even think about it. Unfortunately, little Albert died at a very young age from a non-related matter, obviously. But the fact that he was traumatized could have had a long-term impact on him growing up if he lived longer. So how do we put ethics into practice? Well, we can study sensitive topics. That doesn't. So what this means basically is no topic should be off limit. Everything should be, on the table. You might have an idea that might seem controversial for a study or difficult for a study, but there's ways to make it work in an ethically positive fashion. So take a very small piece of it, of a harmful situation, and then create an experiment around that or a study around that. You don't have to take the entirety of the behavior. Make sure you use informed consent, and if you use deception, you must use debriefing. For example, cheating and stealing. Obviously, you don't want people to cheat and steal in real life, but you can do this in a lab rather than doing it in real life. Whether it's cheating in a game played by a Confederate, someone working for the researcher, or measuring aggression in a video game. This is a lot safer than having someone cheat on an exam, cheat on something else, or assault someone on the street. So you want to keep it in the lab, not in real life where there's too many negative consequences, obviously. How also can we make ethical decisions? Let's say we're studying bullying. You don't want to be studying or inducing bullying in schools. You don't want, your Confederate to go up and start bullying people in schools. That's too impactful. That's not ethical because you can lead to negative consequences in other children. So you have a Confederate, obviously, working for you, but you don't want to do this actually in school. You may want to do this in the lab as part of a sort of a less intense phenomenon. So instead of having someone in school or the Confederate go into the school and just like push the child to the ground and verbally abuse them, you bring the participant into the lab and you have a little bit less intense of an interaction between them where the Confederate may slightly bully them for a short period of time. Because bullying needs to be studied, but you don't want to do it in a way where you're making a situation worse for any participant. Or you can do it naturally, through naturalistic observation. You observe possibly a school playground and you try to figure out why people, what's leading to bullying. Or you can have participants read a story that involves bullying and ask for their reactions. Or even write a story about their experience with bullying. All of this is safer than, creating a bullying situation in real life. That's too intense. That's not going to work. There's too many risks about that study. We want to keep it sort of low key. So examining minor instances of bullying. So how do we conduct our study ethically? We uphold justice by not targeting any participants who are weak, vulnerable, or susceptible, which means no children, no prisoners. Well, children you can use, but not if there's going to be risks involved. And also the problem with using children in studies is you need to have consent from the parent. So you need assent from the child and you need consent from the parent. And that's a very long process, a difficult process that I don't really want to be involved in. Prisoners. Once again, you could work with prisoners, but it's gonna take a lot of work and a lot of hoops to jump through because they're a protected group. Children, prisoners, mentally disabled, mentally ill, these are all protected groups. So to work with them, you need to have your study vetted You need certificates of confidentiality. It's going to take a long time. My mentor in graduate school worked with rapists in a prison. He did some research with rapists, and it took him an entire year to get approval for it. He had to jump through all kinds of hoops to just talk to them, to do interviews with them. It was very difficult. So if you can, try not to target these vulnerable populations because it's very difficult to work with these populations. And you need a lot of approval certifications. You have to jump through a lot of hoops. Fairness. So once we have a sample, we want to randomly assign participants to groups. So you make sure that no one gets, a favorable group. It's all randomly done. And obviously, everybody must have freedom to choose participation or decline it at any time. That means if they're in the study, if they're in your study and they want to leave and they're just tired or they're upset, you must let them leave voluntarily. You cannot stop them. And if you owe them money, so if you were to compensate them in some way, you must give them compensation. You can't just throw them out and not give them money. They have to be compensated in some way. And so this is the consent is, or the freedom to choose participation goes through the informed consent form. That's the first method to sort of tell them what the study is about and let them know they can be approved for the study and let them choose whether to participate. And obviously you want to protect their privacy through either confidentiality or anonymity. So separate the consent forms from the data. They should never be stored together. So you cannot link up any data to the consent forms. And use a coding system. So if you're going to use a confidential system, you need to then assign each participant an alphanumeric code to match up their responses. If you're only collecting data at one point in time, just run it as anonymous. Therefore, you don't have to use a coding system because they're not putting anything on their surveys or on the computers. It's completely anonymous. And if you use deception, which is misleading participants at the beginning of the study, which was done in the Milgram study, you must use debriefing to explain to them why deception was used and what the purpose of the study is and why they had to deceive you. Now, as a participant, you must also behave ethically. It's not just the researchers that have to be ethical. You as a participant must be honest and give truthful responses. Do not be the person that just lies about everything, especially on the surveys. That's social desirability. People want to make themselves look good in the experimenter's eyes. That's not a good way to behave. So as a researcher, we want honest and truthful responses. If you qualify for the study, you're in the study. Don't lie about qualifications just because you want to be in the study because you might want to make some money. That doesn't help us. That hurts us. Also, don't lie about your responses. Give us honest feedback. Give us honest responses. Don't just circle neutral for every item on the survey because you don't feel like reading it. So you're just going to circle neutral, 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 neutral. That's garbage. I ended up throwing that data point out. I can't use that. So why are you doing that? Because you don't want to read the study? Well, then don't participate if you don't want to read the surveys or spend time in the study. Don't write neutral for every response. Don't write strongly agree. This is a bias, right? This is not honest and truthful responses. So we need to provide quality data because the more you're dishonest with us, the less data we can use. And the less data we can use, the harder it is for us to support our hypotheses as researchers. Now, once you're ready to run your study, but before you actually collect data, you must go through, as a researcher, the Institutional Review Board, which was established in 1974. And the reason why it was established by the National Research Act is because of all the unethical studies that I described before in this lecture. That as a country, or in this country, we were conducting so many unethical studies. It just was amazing. and there had to be a stop to it. And the Institutional Review Board says, we need to review your research before you conduct your research. It has a minimum of 5 members, at least one scientist and one non-scientist community member. And you need to then use the informed consent form and use debriefing statement if you use deception. That's mandatory as part of the IRB application. And as I just described, the Milgram study and the Stanford prison experiment came before the IRB, which is why they were allowed to take place. Nowadays, these studies would never, ever, ever be allowed to take place. They are horribly unethical. You would never see this at all. Sometimes the IRB process is difficult as a researcher. It feels like you're jumping through hoops all the time. It just seems like, they're trying to make your life hard. But it is necessary. It's necessary to protect participants in research because you never know what kind of ideas that are out there that may not be such great ideas that could possibly harm the participant. So even though it may seem like an obstacle as the researcher, it is very, very important to get your research through the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, have people look at it and then say it's okay to conduct this research. And there's 3 levels of IRB review. You have exempt, which is minimal risk. There's no known physical or emotional, psychological, or economic risks. And this includes a non-vulnerable population, so no children, no prisoners, no intellectually disabled people, etc. That's exempt. This is basically very little risk and not a protected population. So this is the easiest to get approved. Most of my research studies go through exempt because it's the easiest one to get through, right? I don't want to have too many risks in my studies because it won't get approved. So this is generally reviewed by one person. And if that one person thinks it's okay, it's approved. And in my opinion, that's the best way to go. Then you have expedited, which is minimal risk. So there's some stress involved. There's something there that could be considered a risk. But it could also include a non-vulnerable population, which means it doesn't include children, prisoners, etc. But there's something there that's kind of a little bit risky. And this generally goes to either one or a small committee of people. So this is a step up. Now, if that small committee of people decide I can't approve it or we can't approve it, then it gets sent for full review, which is where you don't want to be. So full review means that your study is greater than minimal risk. So there's something in there that can harm the participant, or you're using a vulnerable population. So I try to avoid this at all costs because your study proposal will have to go to the full IRB, which is at least 5 members, and they have to approve it. Now, in my opinion, it's hard to get approved by one person. That's a lot of work. Trying to get approved by the full board, I mean, it does happen plenty of times, but it's also difficult. You have 5 people now looking for ways to criticize your research. And, the more eyes you have on your proposal, the more problems they're going to find. So try to keep your research exempt. If you have to sort of have some risk involved, like if you're studying stress and you have to induce stress in your participants, then it's usually expedited, which is okay. You want to keep away from full review if you can because you have a great chance of being rejected if it goes to full review. Full review is difficult to get past. I mean, you can get it passed, but it's a lot of work for you to get your study approved. You want to really stay out of that group. If you're using animals, then you have to go through the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. And this ensures the ethical treatments of animals. The labs must be inspected every 6 months and must have proper housing, food, healthcare, and clean conditions. You generally have veterinarians on these committees, and you also have community members. So you have scientists, vets, and community members. And they want to make sure that you're treating your animals well. I've worked with animals, with mice before. No animals other than mice, but the mice were treated very well. The mice had all kinds of care. They even had their own dentist, believe it or not, that come and clean their teeth. So, and the reason why they're taken great care of is because the researchers don't want any confounding variables. They don't want sick mice in their research because then the behavior could be attributed to them being sick rather than them being in a certain condition in the research study. So you have what are called confounding variables or alternative explanations if the mice are not at optimal health. So most researchers keep their labs and their animals, fully, up to par and up to conditions that are required. So here's a summary of ethical principles. You could find the APA general principles on this following website I provided the link for. You want to maintain beneficence and non-maleficence. That means maximize benefits, minimize risk, do no harm. You also want to be mindful of justice. That means using the whole population, not just one particular special group of people that may be prejudiced in some way. You might be prejudiced against them. You also want to have respect for people, which means that people have autonomy. They can make decisions about whether to participate, and they can withdraw at any time. You also want to have responsibility for your research and for maintaining your data. And you want to have integrity, which means you don't want to be biased in any way. You don't want to cheat. People do cheat. You don't want to be that person. So what does scientific integrity really mean? That means you treat your data ethically. Not everyone does this. For example, Diedrich Staple, in a high-profile case, he admitted to fabricating entire experiments published at top journals. So it has been known for very well-known researchers to make up data. They feel pressure in the college or their community. They make up data to get things published. You cannot do this because eventually first off, it's ethically wrong to make up data. You mislead a bunch of people. You mislead a bunch of researchers that want to follow your study and do some other related studies. You basically screw them over because they're going down a dead end because you made up your data. Secondly, someone's going to find out about it. And it may not be this year or next year. It might be 10 or 20 years down the line. Someone's going to talk about it. You're going to be found out. You're going to get fired, embarrassed, shamed, and you'll never be able to conduct research or get published again. You'll basically be out of the field entirely. So in this study, he demonstrated that meat eaters were more selfish than vegetarians, and also that messy and unorganized environments led white people to discriminate more against black people. Obviously, this was made up. He made up the data to support these ideas that he had. You also, obviously, you don't want to fabricate your data, as I mentioned before. You don't want to massage the data, which is kind of, data mining. You look for certain things and then you exaggerate the importance of them. That's like massaging the data. You don't want to drop participants. So if you have participants in there that are creating a problem for you, that means that they're not supporting your hypothesis. You don't want to drop them. That's illegal. You must keep your participants unless their data is not valid. That means like they answer neutral to every question on your survey. Then you can get rid of them because their data is not valid. But just because their data, their responses don't agree with your ideas, you cannot just drop people. Also, reporting only significant results. You should report all your results. The problem is that a lot of journals only want significant results. So if you have non-significant results, which basically means your results aren't good enough if they're non-significant. Statistically, they're not good enough. They won't publish your study. And that's a problem because then people only report significant results And so you don't know what works and what doesn't work because you only report what works. If you report what doesn't work, other people won't go on and conduct research on stuff that doesn't work. And it's important to report those non-significant results. The problem is the journals don't want them. They don't want you to do this. So it's really the journal's fault for doing this. Or including some variables but ignoring other variables. So these variables work for me, these other variables don't. It's very easy to do that. You shouldn't do that though. So one of the controversial areas in data analysis is whether people are sharing the full range of data and results they have analyzed. So instead of reporting what you did and what you found, you pick out the results that best support your hypothesis, the significant results, and you ignore anything that doesn't support your hypothesis. And I think this is the journals that are doing this. I mean, the journals don't want non-significant results. If you start putting all these non-significant results into your article, your manuscript that you're preparing, the journal's likely to reject you, even if you do have significant, interesting results along with those non-significant results. So I feel that this is a journal issue. That if journals were more acceptable of reporting, results that don't support the researchers' hypotheses, I think people would do it. But the journals have kind of frowned upon this, and as a result, people tend to only report things that support their hypotheses. So once the journals change their beliefs in this, I think you'll see a difference in what's reported. You need to also find simple solutions for ethically handling data. So you want to collect enough data if possible. Sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes you're stuck with a small sample. If you have a small sample, try to collect more people. Try to collect another sample and combine the samples to at least have a decent sized sample. In psychology, a decent sized sample is at least, I would say, 100 people if you're doing survey research or even behavioral research. If you're doing MRI research, you're probably going to use less people because the MRI is very expensive. But if you're doing behavioral survey research, self-report data, maybe if you're doing interviews, you can use a little bit less. But you want to collect as much data as you can. I always aim for like 100. If I can collect 200 or 300, that's great. It's very hard to do. It's kind of costly also. But I've had some studies with small samples because they're long studies. My meditation studies that I've done were 10-week studies. I had small samples. Some of the studies I'm doing now have small samples because they're multi-week studies. It's very hard to convince people to come back every week for your study. It's very difficult to get a large number of people coming every week over many weeks for your study. So sometimes you're stuck with small samples, but if you can avoid them, avoid them. List all your variables, obviously, that you're testing. Report even the non-significant or failed results. And if you're using covariates, which are variables that are filtered out or regressed out of the analysis, you don't really know what covariates are, but they're used a lot. They're sort of control variables. If you remove them, you need to tell people that you removed them. You can't just remove them to make your data look better. How do you present your findings? So now that you've cleaned up your data, hopefully not too well, because that would be unethical, you need to present those findings, and this is where you get some really screwy things happening. And I've seen this firsthand at conferences, in talks, job talks even, for faculty, where they present distorted data to support their ideas. So take a look at this graph that's sort of overstating the data. Well, actually, I'll show you that graph in another slide. Let me talk about Darrell Bem's study first. So Darrell Bem was a psychologist at Yale. He's an emeritus now, so he's retired. But one of the last studies he published, he's a parapsychologist, so he studies paranormal activity, which is pretty rare today because that field is kind of dead. No one's really into paranormal psychology or parapsychology. So he's one of the last people that was well known that studied parapsychology. He did a study back, I think in 2010, showing that ESP, extrasensory perception, was real. So people could read minds in a different room, and they beat chance. So they could read what's on your mind better than guessing. Now, when he released this study, the scientific community went crazy, and they condemned him, completely condemned him. And they said extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So if you're going to say this, you need to have significant data to back this up. And what they found was most of his statistical data showing this was kind of weak. It wasn't done correctly, so he used the one-tail tests instead of two-tail tests, non-directional tests, if you know statistics. He used directional tests for everything, which is generally not acceptable if you're trying to publish. And he published in a very high-profile journal. He published in Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, which is shocking. I think that's why he got a lot of pushback. But this is an example of him overstating the data. His data did not support the true idea of ESP. The data was kind of fudged. The statistics were kind of weak. Yet he wrote this paper, published it in a very high-profile journal, and said, I just showed that ESP is real. While the scientific community just kind of destroyed him over it. And I remember the faculty at Rutgers just ripping this guy to shreds, mocking him almost, like how could he even do this? So you don't want to overstate the data. You want to make sure you only draw conclusions that are warranted by the population you're studying and the data that you have. Here's the graph I was talking about. This is what you see a lot of times. So someone will make a point and then they'll put up a bar graph like this. And to me, this is very unethical because you're trying to deceive the audience with the bar graph. So it looks like here, percent who agreed with the court, the Democrats really agreed with the court almost 3 times as much as Republicans and independents. It looks like 3 times as much, but it's not. It's only a small amount more than Republicans and independents. Because if you look at the y-axis, it starts at 50 and it ends at 64. So when you're looking at a graph like this, what they've done is they zoomed in on this small portion of the graph, right? Instead of starting at 0, they started at 50, and they do this to exaggerate the difference between the groups. And you see this all the time. Many people do this. They're trying to prove a point that Democrats are better than Republicans and independents. They agreed 3 times as much. Look at the graph. It looks like 3 times as much, but in reality, it's only 8 points difference out of 100, which is a much smaller difference than what you've seen. And if you started all 3 bars at 0, you would see how small the difference really is. So this is an unethical presentation of the data and the findings. But you see this all the time. You have to be very critical of what people are showing you and make sure they're not trying to lie to you like they are in this graph here, because this is done all the time. So this is misrepresenting data through figures, obviously. We also want to avoid the file drawer problem. There's a bias towards publishing, as I said before, significant results that support your hypothesis. And then if the results that do not support your hypothesis, you put them away. You put them in the file drawer. So in a study of over 4,600 research articles from a variety of scientific disciplines, Finelli found that not only a bias towards publishing papers that support the researcher's hypothesis, but also that this bias has increased 22% over time. So more and more people are just reporting results that support their hypotheses and not supporting all the results. This is the file drawer problem. And this is bad for psychology, it's bad for science in general, because you don't know what does not work. You only know what works. But as a researcher, I want to know what doesn't work, so I don't engage in something that studies what doesn't work, because now I'm wasting my time, but I don't know about it. So if you publish what doesn't work, I won't conduct that research. I'll find something else. But if you don't tell me what doesn't work, I may then engage in or conduct a study on that particular area that didn't work. So it's frustrating. But this is, as I said before, this is due to the journals that don't really embrace non-significant results or results that don't support one's hypotheses. They kind of frown upon this. So once again, I think it's the journal's problem. They need to fix this. So it's not a surprise that researchers include mostly or only significant results for their publications, because that's what the journals want. And how do you present your findings? Well, you want to avoid plagiarism, so always give proper credit, which in this course is in-text citations. You must always cite something that's not your own work. And you can find examples through this website I provided for you. And you must paraphrase, always paraphrase. Summarize others' ideas and then give a citation. Do not use direct quotes in this class. Psychological research generally does not use direct quotes. There's very rare occasions where it's appropriate, but it's almost never appropriate when it comes to summarizing other people's findings. So never paraphrase. Never use direct quotes. Don't use block quotes. Always paraphrase in psychology research. Always. Or any research. You should be paraphrasing everything. If it's not your idea, you must give credit. You must paraphrase.